Hello, this is part 2 of the jacket where I will be working on the canvas and maybe some other stuff if I can move quickly, but otherwise I'll be working on the canvas. So let's get right into it. The supplies that you'll need for doing the structure part of a jacket, of a tailor jacket, you'll need hair canvas, so that's this. You will need some French canvas, this big thing. Ow, this is scratchy. And then you'll also need some twill tape to tape down seam allowances and around the edges. And you can find all of these materials at wawak.com, and I will link that in the description. Yeah, so I will get these ironed and prepped, and then I can start cutting and we can move right into putting everything together. I forgot to mention that you also need flannel. This is not from Wawak, this is from fabric.com, so I'll also link that, and with that we can actually get started. Since getting the jacket together, I've just kind of left it on my table, but it's been Baby Beth's favorite new place to nap. Very silly. You're so cute, Baby Beth. Once the canvas is cut out, divide the shoulder into thirds and mark a 3-inch line on the innermost third. Cut a bias triangle 1.5 inches by 4 inches. Slash open the marked line and insert the bias triangle on the wrong side of the canvas, holding the slit open by 1/2 inch. Cut a few strips of lining or pocketing fabric on the straight of grain. The book I'm using says to use bias, but this strip is meant to stabilize the dart, so it makes more sense to use a piece on the straight of grain. The waist dart is closed by butting the dart edges together and top stitching a strip of lining to the wrong side of the canvas. The haircloth reinforcement gets butted and zigzagged without the lining strip. What you doing, Baby Beth? Men's coats don't have a bust dart, but I'm finishing mine in the same way as the waist dart. For the flannel layer, rather than using a dart which would be bulky, I'm stretching and forming it to a curved shape on the press ham with a liberal use of steam. To get ready for the next fitting, I need to baste all the layers together temporarily. I'm doing this in my lap to make sure the layers all curve in the same way it will on the body. Each layer is being basted individually for control. Fun fact, traditional tailors used to do a lot of their stitching while sitting on their tables. I made my sewing table, so I'm not sure it's stable enough to climb on, but we were encouraged to try it for ourselves in tailoring class. It definitely was easier on a table than in a rolling chair. Once the canvas layers are together, I can baste the whole thing to the jacket layer. Okay, so for this fitting, it's very messy looking, so I apologize for that, but I was trying to just kind of get it together quickly so that I could look at it and then move on. So for this fitting, I basted all the layers of the canvas together, so you can see that in there, really ugly and messy on the inside, and then I also basted that into the coat, and then I made up some muslin sleeves and got that in there. Yeah, so I just wanted to see if everything looks like it's the right size, and then see if the sleeves looked okay, and check all of that, and then I can move on to actually permanently putting all of the canvas and everything in there. If I hold it together about where it would be buttoned, first off, these lapels will be pad stitched back, so they will be a lot more cooperative, because right now they just kind of want to spring forward, which is normal when there's no pad stitching in there. That's the whole point of the pad stitching. And then also I will be cutting these down a lot, like all of the seam allowances will be completely gone. So that will look a lot cleaner when it's actually in there. Same with around the collar. There's like 2 inches, an inch or two of seam allowance up in the collar, which is like far too much. But that'll all get trimmed down. I just wanted to double check everything. So this will attach here, and the roll will go like that, and then it'll also attach, there'll be a closure here. And so what I think is happening right now is the arm's eye is just too low. Like you can see how it's kind of pulling away a lot right there. That's just like, it's just a little too low. I can't lift my arm. So for example, if I was to push this higher up into my armpit, then I'm able to raise my arm quite a bit more. So how I stand normally, I think it is, there's a couple drag lines going this way. So I'll have to, I think, rotate it. Yeah, I'll have to set it so that it's a little bit rotated towards the front, I believe. I'll double check that and make a note of that. I think I need to set it a little bit more towards the front so that when my arm hangs normally instead of like behind myself, that doesn't create drag lines. When it comes down to it, I do want this to be a little bit narrower. My shoulder is about here, so that's around a full inch. So that can come in about an inch. This can come up about an inch, and that'll actually, so that'll be able to keep the sleeve basically how it is, because everything will just kind of shift up by an inch. So that will actually be fine. I think this size looks pretty good. It could maybe come in a little bit. I did that alteration I was talking about. That side looks janky. Let's go to this side. I did that alteration, and I think maybe I let it out just a hair too much. So I'll take that in basically just 1/8 of an inch. And other than that, the hem is looking a little uneven, but the hem's not in there permanently. I just kind of basted it up very quickly, so that'll get fixed. I think that aside from those issues, I'm pretty ready to move on, and I can start with the pad stitching. Now that the fitting is done, I can put the layers together for real. The canvas layers get basted together in my lap again, more precisely this time. Once the canvas layers are basted together, it's time to start pad stitching. This is done on the tailor's ham with the wrong side facing towards the ham. Stitching this way helps draw the shaping in the correct direction, reinforcing the curve it needs to take to lay flat on the body. When pad stitching is done, it should make a chevron or arrow shape. I'm right-handed, so I take my stitches right to left. The stitches that show on the face then always travel left to right. But because I'm stitching up one row, then down the next, they look like they go in opposite directions horizontally. After the canvas is all pad stitched, fell stitch around the edge of the flannel piece. Leave the arm's eye edge free. You can see the little indents of my pad stitching on this side of the flannel. When taking the stitches, I was careful to only grab a few of the outermost threads. This ensures the stitching doesn't show through and all you see are the indents. Not so important on the canvas, but it's very important on the lapel. Now that the canvas is all firmly together, we can start attaching it to the jacket front. Be very careful to smooth everything out, as once there are ripples after this point, they'll be impossible to steam out. First, I'm pinning along the front edge of the dart just to get a little bit of control so I can start basting. When laying the two pieces together, I'm offsetting the dart by about 3/4 of an inch. This is where all that extra seam allowance comes in. The first line of basting goes basically where I put those pins. Start about 3 inches below the shoulder and baste all the way down to the hem, smoothing as necessary. Here I'm flipping back the front edge of the jacket and stitching the dart to the canvas. Normally you would stitch the pocket to the canvas, but my pocket doesn't extend past the dart. The breast pocket did extend into the side of the canvas though, so I'm whip stitching the pocket bag to the canvas.
Good girl! your tailbase back. Get her baby back.
The second line of basting runs across the waistline from the dart to about 1 inch from the front edge of the jacket. About halfway between the dart line basting and the front edge of the jacket, baste from the waistline stitch down to the hem. I flipped the jacket around to get it better, so sorry if it's disorienting. The next stitch line follows the edge of the jacket about 1 inch in from the waistline down to the hem, then around the corner and along the hem. With the bottom half basted, it's time to start on the top. Smooth the fabric up and out towards the lapel and take a basting stitch from the waist up to 3 inches below the shoulder. I've made the roll line in the front edge a little more visible here. The next stitch is taken 1 inch from the edge, starting at the waist and traveling into the roll line. Before I finish basting everything together, the other side of the pocket gets stitched to the canvas. I'm pinning it so everything stays smooth, then whip stitch the pocket edge to the canvas. We're almost done basting! This next stitch starts at the shoulder and travels along the arm side, then back into the waistline. The final basting stitch is basting the bias curve of the arm side into the canvas so it doesn't stretch out while being handled. Trim the canvas even with the cut edge of the jacket. Get your assistant to help you with cross-stitching the canvas to the pocket reinforcement. Smooth out the lapel, then check and remark the outer seam allowances if necessary. Remark the lapel roll line as well. All of the lapel pad stitching will fall in this area. Measure a piece of twill tape to match your roll line and cut it with a bit of seam allowance on either end. This reinforces the roll line so it doesn't distort or stretch out. Pin, then baste to the inside of the roll line on the canvas side. You can see where I started pad stitching without. That was a mistake, and I ended up taking out those stitches and redoing them. Slip stitch the tape down, traveling between the canvas and outer fabric, taking only small prick stitches in the face fabric and catching just the edge of the tape. What's up? Hello? Pad stitching the lapel is pretty much the same as pad stitching the canvas layers. You want to curve the fabric while taking each stitch to make sure the lapel wants to lay against the body. This is the part where it's extra important to take small stitches since it's technically on the face of the garment. Because there's a 1-inch strip of black all down the front edge of Yumeko's jacket, I've switched to black thread so if some of my stitches show through, it'll still be the same color. And that's all the pad stitching done. Next, we're running twill tape along the edge of the jacket. The twill tape gets pinned, then diagonally basted in. When you get to the corner, clip the twill tape almost through, leaving a few threads intact. Then lay the cut edge in line with the top edge of the lapel. Laying it this way rather than creating a fold makes the corner less bulky. I like to do each straight section at a time in case the tape contracts or grows as I'm stitching. Once you get to the bottom of the roll line, pinch the twill tape so there is a bubble of about 1/4 inch. Giving this extra ease will let the lapel fold without strain. I like to take a back stitch on either side of the bubble so I know I can be sure it doesn't accidentally get worked out. When you get to the corner where the front edge meets the hem, do the same clip into the twill tape and fold over each side. Once the tape is all basted, stitch down each side with a slip stitch like the one on the roll line reinforcement. I started with red thread at the neckline, but once I got to the black strip at the front, I switched to black thread. When I get to the hem past the black strip, I switched back to the red. So for the first side, I cut the canvas seam allowance off after slip stitching the twill tape down, but quickly realized it was difficult to make it really clean when done in this order. For the second side, I cut the seam allowance after basting, but before slip stitching. This turned out much easier. It would probably be easier still to cut it before adding the twill tape at all, but I worried that wouldn't be quite as precise. Carefully pull the basting stitches out without marring the front of the fabric or pulling on any important stitches. For this jacket, I'll be attaching the facing by machine, but it can also be attached by hand. Usually with an all-wool jacket, you can do some iron working to shape the facing, but as my facing is very polyester, it won't do much stretching or contracting. Place the jacket and facing right sides together, with the facing extending past the front of the jacket. Pin along the edge, then baste through the middle of the tape. At the tip of the lapel and at the bottom of the roll line, add about 1/4 inch of ease, similar to what we did with the tape earlier. This ease in the corner of the lapel will help the point lay toward the body rather than pulling forward away from the body. Machine stitch from the collar notch to the bottom of the jacket along the outside edge of the tape. Trim down the seam allowances. Above the roll line, trim the jacket seam allowance 1/4 inch and the facing 3/8 of an inch. Below the facing, trim the jacket side longer and the facing side shorter. Clip into the top lapel seam allowance at the collar notch and trim the seam allowance down on the edge closer to the front. Press the seam open, then press the seam allowance around the tip of the lapel in towards the canvas. Tack the seam allowance down to the tape a few inches to either side of the lapel point. The stitches should not show on the outside of the jacket. This helps the lapel lay flatter than if the seam allowance is not controlled. Fold the hem allowance up and baste into place with diagonal tailor stitches. Now you can turn the facing to the inside of the jacket so right sides are out. Baste along the front edge with a wide running stitch. Below the roll line, draw the facing towards the inside of the seam so it doesn't show when worn. Above, do the same with the jacket face. On the facing side, baste from the bottom of the roll line to the top of the lapel, then towards the collar notch using a diagonal stitch. Then, baste from the tip of the lapel towards the roll line, holding the lapel folded back as it will lay when worn. On the jacket side, baste along the roll line, catching all layers. The next step is slashing into the facing at the neck edge, so I first checked my pattern so I don't make any mistakes. While I'm not marking perfectly where my pattern was, I'm checking it against where the tape is laying inside the jacket and making sure both sides are symmetrical. Once that's marked, the seam allowance can be trimmed down and the facing slashed a ½ inch past the roll line. This gets folded under, then basted down. Press this down, then slip stitch from the collar notch to where the facing was slashed, then press everything again to set it all, and then the facing is done.
Thank you for watching. This was part 3 of Yumeko Jabami school uniform and part 2 of making the jacket. I know that some of the information was a lot and it was probably kind of dry, but hopefully it was informative and not too boring. The next couple steps are finishing the linings and then putting the sleeves together and in the jacket, and then also the collar, and then that should be pretty much it. So next video should hopefully also be the reveal. Yeah, so hopefully we'll be moving right along and I will be showing you guys how to do the sleeves and how to do the collar and how to do the lining. The collar is the last place that we'll be doing a lot of pad stitching. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next video. If you liked this video, found it informative, please give it a like and leave a comment. If you thought it was too dry or confusing, or you have any questions or constructive criticism, please comment that as well. I love to hear the constructive criticism because I am still kind of getting my bearings with making videos. Yeah, awesome. So, bye!